From the start of the war until 1944, the Nazi war machine had occupied much of Europe. But on the 6th of June, the Allies finally launched their campaign to liberate the continent.
This was it. I mean, this is the thing that you train for, this is what you're going to do, and it was quite keen.
The D-Day landing saw the largest amphibious assault in history in an effort to gain a toehold in Nazi-occupied France.
You could have walked from the Isle of Wight across to France without getting your feet wet. You felt so great.
Rocket ships fired 200 rockets in one go, I think. Other sorts of little warships are flying around, all were firing.
If the German troops were able to prevent the initial landings, the campaign to liberate Western Europe would fail and German occupation would continue.
The first wave had already gone in and been slaughtered. As soon as you dropped the ramp, they were hitting us.
You knew that once you got in sight of that beach, you were going to lose a lot of men. All young men too.
This is the story of the men who fought and died for freedom in the climactic battle of World War II. The Allies had seriously underestimated the strength of the German forces at the start of World War II. Nazi equipment, transport and firepower was far superior to much of their own outdated armory. As the Blitzkrieg onslaught spread into France, the retreating British Expeditionary Force were effectively cut off from nearly all of the escape routes to the English Channel. A desperate rescue operation from the beaches of Dunkirk evacuated some 338,000 soldiers back to the UK. Churchill prepared Britain for a Nazi invasion.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
From the start of the war up to D-Day, it gradually got worse for supplies, for food. The bombing at different places. I did 2 or 3 jobs in London. The things that I used to hate more than anything was the doodlebugs, the V2s. They were, the one bomb that they had was very demoralizing. I suppose really the V1 was a laugh because you could hear them coming and then you'd hear them put, put, put. The engine would stop and then you used to take bets on where it was going to land.
Once the threat of Nazi invasion had receded, Churchill knew an overall victory would only be possible if the Allies once again crossed the English Channel and got a foothold in Hitler's fortress Europe. But with many British troops deployed overseas in various theatres of war, new soldiers were needed.
The main British Army, of course, was out in either the Far East or in North Africa, going into Italy, you see. They had to make really a fresh army, a new army, which is what the 18-year-old conscript of 1942 made.
There were very few of my unit or of the brigade who'd actually, shall we say, been to war. We were all green, and I think, in a way, ignorance is bliss. You know, it might sound stupid, but as a young man, it's a bit of a game.
I didn't wait to be called up, they lowered the recruiting age, and in November 1942 I was 17 and a quarter, which they lowered out, so I volunteered then. But basically it was what we did. In those days we volunteered to fight for our country.
From 1940 to 1944, the British Army had doubled in size to 1.5 million men. Training this huge and complex force for the invasion would take many months. Towns had civilians evacuated for the soldiers as acres of land turned into military camps.
We went up to Inveraray in Scotland, and we'd had done an assault across the lake. They'd rigged the scramble nets up, which we had to go from the big ship into the small ship. And actually we lost 3 men. They fell over the side and got drowned.
We spent a lot of time attacking a gun battery, which was rigged up. And there was loads and loads of field firing exercises where we used live ammunition. We also spent a lot of time assaulting pillboxes and things like that, and laying minefields.
I can remember a sergeant giving a lecture on mines, and he had a mine which exploded whilst he was trying to defuse it, and his body was wheeled around the camp so as to let the troops know exactly what happened when a mine exploded.
In 1941, the war took a dramatic turn. In June, Germany turned on its former ally and invaded the USSR. And then in December, Japan attacked the American naval base in Pearl Harbor. Churchill was now joined by Stalin and Roosevelt in the fight against fascism. But the Allied leaders couldn't agree on what strategy would lead them to victory.
We had the broadcasts on radio. We only had radio in those days, and we only got what the people told us. Like Stalin was having a moan because we wasn't doing anything on to create a second front, which D-Day was the start of the second front.
The press, the newspapers, were always on about the second front. And we knew we were being trained for something, and we knew with all the build-up of Americans coming into the country, we knew that something was going to happen sooner or later, but we didn't know when. Well, we didn't know if it was France even.
In May 1943, the planned attack on Germany was finally given its name, Operation Overlord. The American Dwight D. Eisenhower was chosen as Supreme Commander. Masses of US soldiers arrived in Britain in preparation for the invasion of Northwest Europe.
The saying was, over here, overpaid and oversexed. They were a nuisance.
I don't think the British soldier was pleased to see the Americans, for the simple reason that they were paid much better than us. And more importantly still, they got the girls, and we didn't. And that didn't go down well.
From the outset, planning for Operation Overlord focused on where best to penetrate the German coastal defences. Stretching from northern Norway to the Franco-Spanish frontier, these defences were known as the Atlantic Wall. Whilst Calais in France offered the shortest distance for the Allies to travel, it was also one of the most heavily defended ports. Despite this, many in the Army Command wanted to land here. However, Normandy was chosen because the beaches were fairly close to English ports and well within range of Allied aircraft stationed in the UK. The Allies knew that their attack was not going to be a surprise, but to give themselves the best chance of success, they launched Operation Fortitude, a plan of deception to make the Germans think they would be landing in Calais.
What the British military did, and which is a very good idea really, was to build rubber dummies, rubber tanks, replicas only made out of all sorts of things, and put them in fields in near enough the whole of Kent, round the back of Dover, Canterbury, and all down there. There were acres and acres and acres of them. And from the sea and from the air, it looked as though there were masses of soldiers being massed in this particular area, because we wanted them to think that we were going to land in the Pas de Calais.
By the spring of 1944, the Allies were ready to make their assault. The plan was to ferry 160,000 men to the beaches of Normandy, whilst nearly 10,000 paratroopers would jump behind enemy lines. To transport the troops, the Navy and Merchant Navy made available 195,000 men and 5,000 ships. It was to be the largest and most impressive armada ever assembled. British General Bernard Montgomery, who had successfully defeated the Germans in the North African desert, was put in charge of land operations.
We had great faith in Montgomery. He was that sort of general. He served in the First World War, and he wouldn't do an attack unless he had the stuff. So we knew that we were going to be supported every time he'd done something. He wasn't a rash general trying to make his name.
Oh, I like Monty. You know, hello chaps. And I think the phrase was, forgive it being on tape or the phrase was, he's a little shit, but he's all right. You know, that was the thing. And he was a good general. He great respect for him. You don't follow people you don't trust, you don't believe in.
Montgomery's old adversary from the North African campaign, Erwin Rommel, was assigned to improve the Atlantic Wall's defences. A string of reinforced concrete pillboxes were built along the beaches to house anti-tank guns and light artillery. Minefields were planted on the beaches, and underwater obstacles and mines were placed in waters just offshore. Unlike at the Battle of El Alamein, Rommel was determined the German defence line would hold and that the British would be pushed back into the sea.
He was a good general. He chased us through the desert, didn't he? Till we pushed him back. He was a good general. He was another, what I would call a soldier's general.
It's not often you hear the enemy talk about one of the enemy's officers, but Rommel, when he wasn't in the desert, he used to go around and visit all his own troops and our troops who were in the hospitals and ask them if they've been treated all right. He was an officer and a gentleman.
Only a few days in each month were suitable for launching Operation Overlord because both a full moon and a low tide were required. The moon to illuminate navigational landmarks for the crews of aircraft, gliders and landing craft, and the low tide to help safe navigation around German defensive obstacles.
The invasion was going to be June the 5th, but the storm blew up and we didn't, they decided it was too risky, so they delayed it for 24 hours. But we was off Spithead in the Isle of Wight, and there was a massive ships there.
The Allied troop convoys already at sea were forced to take shelter in bays and inlets on the south coast of Britain for the night as the storm raged.
We went into a very, very stormy sea, rough sea. Roughly 300 on our boat, and 9 out of 10 of us were seasick. All I wanted to do was to get off that boat. I was so ill, so seasick.
Some, I reckon, were dying. I mean, it took us 2 days to get from a place called Fowey on the big ships, because they transferred them into the landing craft. And some of them were, well, just dying, I reckon.
We were given bromide tablets, but I think the War Department thought they wouldn't be much good to us because they also gave us paper bags marked vomit for the use of. So
The Germans took comfort from the poor conditions and believed no invasion would be possible for several days. Some troops even stood down, and Erwin Rommel took a few days' leave to celebrate his wife's birthday. At a vital meeting on June the 5th, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist forecast a brief improvement in the weather for the following day. Operation Tonga, the first stage of Overlord, was given the green light. 10,000 paratroopers were flown behind enemy lines to disrupt German supply routes and defences in order to minimise the threat to the beach landings.
We took off at about 11:30 on the night of the 5th of June. We were told what our objectives were: to capture the canal bridge over the Caen Canal and the road bridge over the River Orme. They had to be seized and captured intact.
To disrupt Allied airborne landings, the Germans placed 12-foot poles with sharpened tops on potential landing zones, which the troops called Rommel's asparagus. Low-lying river and estuaries were flooded, which made flight navigation extremely difficult, and many men were dropped miles away from their intended landing zones.
Because of the flooded area, the air crews dropped where they could, and they themselves were bemused because of the floods, so they couldn't see the Deves. There was just a great flooded area. Some of them confused the rivers. Some were dropped 20 miles away, literally miles away. I landed and found myself all alone. Now, I should have landed amongst the whole of the 9th and the 1st Canadian Para-Battalion. So there should have been something like 1,200 men around me.
Much of the equipment dropped from the planes was lost in the floods, and many paratroopers struggled landing in the water.
Heavily laden troops, if you land in water and with a parachute landing on top and being under the canopy or mixed up with their rigging lines, and of course some of them could have had a fairly heavy landing and been stunned. There were a number of people listed missing and a number were drowned.
As part of the airborne operation, the Allies used gliders attached to tow planes to land men in Normandy. The Horsa glider could carry up to 25 men and flew into enemy territory low and fast to avoid being picked up on radar. Many were shot down by anti-aircraft guns or crash-landed. The first military action of the campaign happened just after midnight, when 6 Horsa gliders landed within a few feet of a target bridge.
To land the way they did, right on top Pegasus Bridge, was marvellous, marvellous. It certainly took the Germans by surprise. The whole idea, of course, was to capture that bridge and also the one across the adjacent River Orme, so as to stop any German assault coming in from surrounding areas.
The control of Pegasus Bridge enabled the Allies to disrupt any German reinforcements heading to the beaches. It also provided a route for advancement if the beach landings were successful and Allied ground forces pushed inland. On the 6th of June, with a break in the weather, the assembled armada set sail for the invasion of the Normandy coast.
It did ease down the weather, and next thing he said, right, we go, and that's what happened. And you could have walked from the Isle of Wight across to France without getting your feet wet. And the aircraft were about 30 or 40 feet above the sea. It was it felt so great.
This was it. I mean, this is the thing that you train for, this is what you're going to do. And it was quite keen. Quite some of the lads were quite keen, we've never been in action before, so we didn't know what it was like. And I think if we knew what it was like, we wouldn't have been so keen.
I wasn't nervous or afraid. I was very apprehensive as to what was going to happen to me. Would I see my parents again? Would I see my girlfriend, who later became my wife? Would I see her again? But in the end, I found myself a camouflage netting, lay down on that and went to sleep.
The vast aerial power of the Allies ensured their armada was free from a German air attack. The whole fleet was spearheaded by 287 minesweepers that cleared the way for the other vessels. Behind them, 138 warships bombarded the German beach defences in Normandy itself.
We were allowed out on deck as the sea abated and we were watching what we could see. And We could see smoke and little matchstick men running about, sort of thing, and we didn't want to go there, sort of thing. But and then we were called back, and another lot came up to get some air, quite frankly. It's a pretty horrible journey. That was.
As you look towards the shore, it's covered in smoke, and you think, well, is that where we're going to go? What's happening there? And in the middle of all that smoke, you see the flashes of the shells exploding, and things like that. You think, well, must be all right. By the time we get there, all that would have gone on a bit further. The guns would have opened up their range and firing beyond that.
When I hear of Navy gunners, they were fairly accurate. What they fired for, they hit. Over the top of that was destroyers going round, and they signalled to one another, whoop, 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 going round like they were floating, going round quite fast, some of them. Rocket ships fired 200 rockets in one go on them. Other sorts of little warships are flying around, and all were firing. Planes going over the top, strafing, it was all exploding. They really had a go at that beach, I tell you. I wonder if anything left of it.
Despite the fact that the warships and the RAF were throwing everything they could at the German Atlantic Wall, the defences were holding and firing back at the approaching forces.
They were getting the range, these 88s were coming out at us, and they were knocking, they were absolutely first-class guns. I mean, what they were meant for really was aircraft, but they found they were so good at knocking things out, these 88s, that they concentrated on the landing craft.
Over 4,000 landing craft of differing types and sizes were loaded up with troops ready to invade the beaches.
We went to the mothership and they loaded the troops down the scramble necks into the landing craft. Many a time some couldn't hold on, and the weight of the gear used to fall into between the landing craft and also the mothership. And you never see them no more.
It was a bit tidal, and you get some off, and the landing craft to come up, and then all of a sudden a wave would take you and it'd push them into the water, hit them before they could move. And some of them got drowned like that.
We were given waterproofs, but apparently it quickly came down, I suppose it happened to others, that they were full of air. So the order come round, and apparently a lot of blokes were safe by just stabbing them with a bayonet, taking a bayonet and cutting them with a bayonet, because they're full of air, and when you come off the boat, your legs fill up and you were drowned.
Well, you were pushing your way through dead bodies. I mean, say, you get one sticking out the water, you'd be going over the top of one or something like that. And then you had the Belgian gates, which were meant, where they cross like that. They were meant to rip the bottom of the landing crafts out, which they did do.
The Germans were expecting any landing to happen during a high tide, when in fact the Allies had planned for a low tide assault to enable easier navigation through the Belgian gates and mines. However, the big disadvantage caused by a low tide was the beaches were now much longer. Troops had much more ground to cover before they could reach safety.
As soon as you dropped the ramp, they were hitting us, just slaughtering them. All along the top, there were 65 separate machine gun pits. And if you put your hand up like that, I'd have it. They were so good. They were so good. The machinery and the guns they had were so... I think they were far superior to what we had.
You knew that once you got in sight of that beach, you were going to lose a lot of men. We didn't lose as many as we thought we were going to lose, but we lost enough. All young men to 18, 19, 20.
In order to protect their troops, the Allies had a host of tanks specially modified for the invasion, dubbed Hobart's Funnies after Percy Hobart, an armoured war expert who developed them. The DD Shermans were amphibious swimming tanks. Launched around 2 miles offshore, they could make their own way to the beaches to support the infantry. To clear a path through the minefields on the beaches, the crab tank had a rotating steel flail on its front that destroyed mines it crossed. The bobbin carried 10 foot of canvas reinforced with steel, which was laid as a path so that tanks and other vehicles following would not sink into the sandy beaches. The Crocodile was a Churchill tank that had been given a flamethrower instead of a cannon. The flames could be fired over 120 feet and proved effective in clearing bunkers and striking fear into the enemy. Hobart's funnies were a successful addition to the British landing troops, but German defences around the Atlantic Wall remained effective.
You think with some lads, I mean, they did Italy, Sicily, and went right through without a scratch to do all those 3 landings, went right through a scratch to Germany. Others lads, like me, had never been in action before, virtually didn't get off the boat.
We were firing at them, keeping their heads down, but you're bound to lose some. He'd been preparing them positions for 4 years. Since he knocked us out of France, he'd been preparing.
Rommel believed that the improvements he had made to the Atlantic Wall would have to halt the invasion on the beach and push the Allies back into the English Channel, or Germany would lose the war. It was the job of the airborne forces to take out machine gun emplacements along the wall and destroy the bridges that would prevent the Germans from reinforcing their defences.
9th Battalion were to capture the gun battery at Merville, which thought to be a threat to the invading troops, the beach landings. And the squadron was to blow 5 bridges over the River Deves.
By taking out the bridges, the Allies would prevent the easy arrival of German supplies and reinforcements to the beaches, and so gain a crucial advantage.
We reached the bridge and there was a few Canadian soldiers. Because the Canadians were giving us protection. They were to fan out to give us cover whilst we destroyed the bridge. Having completed that, on the way back, a German jeep pulled up with 4 Germans in it and mistaken the Canadians for German troops. I started asking questions, and when they realised their mistake, they attempted to drive away, and of course the Canadians riddled them, and the vehicle was undrivable. And we had to pass by them, and I remember passing. They were the first dead Germans I saw.
Of the 700 paratroopers committed to taking the Merville battery, only 150 men were ready to attack. The rest were lost in the countryside, wounded or had drowned in the marshes. Lieutenant Colonel Ottaway, who was in charge of the mission, decided the target was too important to abandon.
Merville Battery was Ottaway's lot, and they all landed in the wrong place, and he took that battery and silenced those guns, although the Germans retook it. But he silenced those guns, and which was a good thing, because otherwise his guns would have fired upon Sword Beach and made it even worse than it was.
The Normandy coastline chosen for the invasion consisted of 5 beaches which were split between the Allies. The 2 British beaches, codenamed Sword and Gold, the 2 American beaches, Utah and Omaha, and the Canadian beach, Juno.
I landed with the 3rd Canadian Division on Juno Beach. The Royal Engineers had been at work there and had opened up a bit of the promenade for the guns and the lorries and all that sort of thing to get up onto the promenade, onto the roadway beyond the promenade. There's countless bodies on that beach, mainly from the French-Canadian unit that came in alongside of us. The regiment de la Chandelle, they lost quite a lot of men there. Mind you, we didn't stop to count them or anything like that, but they were there.
Each beachhead had to be secured and then all linked up to allow for easier reinforcements of troops, equipment and fuel. In the American sector, the landing at Utah Beach, despite occurring slightly south of the target area, proceeded according to plan, as the US 4th Division advanced rapidly inland with few casualties. Omaha Beach, however, turned into an open killing field. German gun emplacements had been well placed and tore into the American soldiers as they left the landing craft. Ships carrying tanks sank, leaving the surviving troops with little cover. The sprint across the beach to safety proved fatal for many.
It was a slow progress going across there, but we arrived off Omaha Beach early hours when it was getting just light, and the first wave had already gone in and been slaughtered.
They kept landing their first wave, second wave, third wave onto the beach, knowing full well that the first wave hadn't got off the beach, and it was only a tiny beach really, from the promenade to the sea itself.
Coming under heavy fire, the engineers set about their task of clearing gaps through the beach obstacles, work made more difficult by loss of equipment. They also suffered heavy casualties as enemy fire set off the explosives they were working with. The resulting chaos made easy targets for German gunners.
They kept bunging men on the beach with nowhere to go. And whereas us at Gold Beach, they laid us on the beach like they've always laid at Omaha. They couldn't get off the beach. Just would have been mowed down. And I think the British way of fighting was a little bit more sensible. And I think the Americans were badly led.
The British sector proceeded more smoothly. Despite rough seas and higher than expected tides, which hindered the clearance of beach obstacles, excellent naval gunfire support kept German defensive fire suppressed at Sword Beach. On Gold, the obstacles were more numerous than expected, and many landing craft were lost. This hindered the build-up of forces on the beach, but most of the German strongpoints had been nullified by shore bombardment earlier in the morning. The British still suffered 400 casualties while securing the beachhead.
The hard thing for us was when we're going up the beach, our mate gets hit alongside us. We were told on no occasion were we to stop and help anybody. People that come along behind would do that. And it was very hard to see your mate go down and not being able to help him. But as I was getting off the landing craft, I see the blood running onto the sand, and I realised I'd been hit. But going up the beach, I got a shot through the chest, bullet through the chest. And next thing I remember, getting up to the top of the beach, and I must have passed out. I remember no more about D-Day until I was being picked up by the stretcher bearers.
The Allied fatalities for D-Day have been estimated at 2,500, along with 10,000 casualties. The British total was roughly 1,000 on Gold Beach and the same number on Sword Beach. The remainder of the British losses were amongst the airborne troops. Some 600 were killed or wounded, and 600 more were missing. The total German casualties are estimated as being between 4,000 and 9,000 men.
The majority of the German soldier, he was just like me. When I first see one of the dead Germans, I looked at him and I thought, so he ain't no different to me. He's got a mother and father. And you could see, you'd see a German medical chap tending to one of ours and vice versa. You look up the road or look up the cliffs and there, you can see them still killing each other. Absolutely ridiculous, when you look at it that way, Why are we doing it? They all got mothers and fathers, and you could hear them saying, like, Mum, 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 and, You couldn't do nothing for them.
I feel so sorry for their parents and that. We always think when we look at the grave there's some mother's son there or some husband there. It's a very hard thing to do.
By the end of D-Day, 150,000 Allied men had managed to land in Normandy. In spite of this considerable success, the Allies had to swiftly stabilize the beachheads and then conduct breakout operations if they were to take full advantage of the invasion. The build-up of adequate supplies was therefore crucial to Allied aspirations.
What really made the D-Day thing was a success was the fact that Hitler had decided we can't do a landing, we got a port to get supplies in quickly. But he didn't know about the Mulberry Harbour.
One of the greatest difficulties of the opening of the Second Front was that of supply. The enormous problem of supplying and reinforcing our men through inadequate harbours was one that had to be overcome. And it was overcome, as we all know. Huge prefabricated harbours solved the problem, each providing accommodation equal to Dover. These pictures, taken as the huge armada of ships and harbour installations prepared to set out, give some idea of the size of the undertaking. What a target for submarines and the Luftwaffe, if they'd been able to get to grips.
Mulberry was a funny sort of thing. It looked like a big box made out of concrete, built in sections, and the concrete floated. Daft, innit? Connect them together, you got a pierhead.
The next job was the construction of the piers. This consisted of a steel roadway built on a number of bridge sections with flexible joints between to allow for the rise and fall of the tide. The sections were mounted on pontoons of steel or concrete designed to rest on the seabed when the water receded. The piers give direct access to the shore for unloading even the heaviest equipment.
What we done on the British sector, on Gold Beach, they took some old block ships over that were no good anymore and sunk them to stop the full weight of the tide on the harbour. And it worked. But they didn't do that on the American sector, where they were also putting up a harbour, and a storm blew up and completely wrecked the one at Omaha. But ours had survived, but got damaged, and I think they towed part of the damaged portions from Omaha and repaired the British one. I went back 7 weeks later and I landed on the Mulberry Harbour, and it was much easier than the first time.
In the months following D-Day, the British Mulberry Harbour was used to land over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles and 4 million tons of supplies, providing much-needed reinforcements. The Allies needed a huge amount of fuel to keep the army advancing through France. To overcome the problem of getting oil from Britain, a major engineering project was put in place to send a pipeline across the English Channel.
The pipeline was one of the finest things ever invented for the Second World War. Of the way in which they were going to get fuel, how could they do it? Well, we hadn't got satellites and things like that in those days, so the only thing they could do was under the ocean.
Operation Pluto is another of those top secrets which can only now be revealed. Engineers devised a kind of pipe called Hamel pipe, which made in 20-foot pieces could be welded into any required length. This pipe was so flexible that it could be wound on a drum like cotton on a reel. A plan developed whereby the full length of pipe required to cross the channel could be taken over and laid in one continuous piece. This was in fact done by means of floating drums known as HMS conundrums, or canuns for short. The canun is 90 foot long and over 50 foot in diameter. When fully wound, it weighs 1,600 tons, about the weight of a destroyer, and can carry 70 miles of pipeline.
Crucial to the success of Pluto was the capture of Port-en-Bessin, which was heroically taken by a small force of Royal Marine commandos.
Quite a few boats were hit. The survivors swam ashore, picked up the weapons from the wounded and the killed, and marched, fighting all the way to Porto-Besson, 12 odd miles away. And overnighted outside against next day, fought a far superior German force and took it. They sailed in a tanker and connected the oil pipe to the tanker and pumped the oil into the tanker. There was no refinery ashore. And they offloaded it onto that particular way. But without oil, the tanks would have grounded to a halt, our tanks. So it was a very important thing.
With Port-en-Bessin in British hands, along with the American-held Cherbourg, oil soon started pumping to the Allies from the English coast and the Isle of Wight. To prevent a German attack, the pumps were hidden in disguised buildings. Although the beaches had been secured, the battle for Normandy was far from over. As the Allied soldiers pushed inland, fierce fighting ensued as the Germans battled to keep hold of strategic territories.
I've got to be fight. They're saying that we took casualties as heavy as the Somme at times. And we did lose a lot of blokes. Hill 112, which thank God I didn't fight on, the 43rd Wessex fought there, and they lost whole platoons are disappearing. It's not the highest point in Normandy, but they say, the Germans actually said it, whoever controls Hill 112 controls Normandy. They called it the British Overhaul. Really fierce fighting went out there. Whole platoons were disappeared, never found them again.
In 2 days' fighting alone, the Allies suffered more than 2,000 casualties. The slopes of the hill were ablaze with the wrecks of British tanks knocked out by the SS Panzer units in occupation of the high ground. Much of Normandy was made up of small fields, high hedgerows and sunken lanes. This slowed down the advancing Allies and enabled the Germans to set up hidden artillery and infantry defences. It was tailor-made for ambushes.
Once I was with the section and we fought hand to hand with some Germans, and that was pretty horrible. This young German soldier, about my age, I was 19 by then, he stepped out this hedge and I killed him. And I sat on the ground and cried and was sick. I killed a human being. And that was terrible. I've got talking to you now, I can see that young, ginger-headed German soldier. Some other son. Some other son.
The balance of military capability in Normandy favoured the Allies. However, experienced German soldiers made great use of limited equipment and positional advantages to frustrate any British advances. The strategically important city of Caen became a thorn in the Allies' side.
Caen was situated at the centre of the roads which led to Paris, to Bayeux, in fact to all other parts of France, really. And it was essential, being a major city, a major junction, railway junction as well, that it came into Allied hands as soon as possible.
It was expected that Caen would fall into Allied hands shortly after the breakout from the beaches. Things did not go quite to plan. Rommel's army divisions had built up strong defences around the city.
Caen wasn't captured, and it should have been captured on D-Day. They tried to capture Caen coming around from the east, and they came through our lines. We know that was an absolute fiasco because it came to nothing. 3 or 4 days after the attack started, we had a lot of rain, but we know that the Germans completely outgunned our tanks. Their 88 was an incredible gun, and it could be used anti-aircraft, anti-tank, anti-personnel.
The hardest thing which I could not do was German tanks as well as our tanks. They blew up, or burned, we call it blown up. In fact, the Germans and some of our boys called the Shermans Tommy Cookers or Ronsons, because they Ronson because they lit at the first flame or something. Flew got first hit, something like that, and they would burn up. And because the boys would be trapped inside, you couldn't get them out. The heat was so fierce. But our officer could pull a pin out grenade and chuck it in the tank. I couldn't do that. Put them out in the misery virtually.
The SS soldiers defending the city, most of whom had graduated from the Hitler Youth, had a fierce loyalty to their Führer and took great honor from fighting to the death for the Nazi cause. Many of the Allies thought this fanatical and wanted to keep their own casualties down to a minimum.
The SS, Hitler Youth, they were nasty individuals. Politics. They were animals, for want of a better word. And the story I tell was the Canadians on Juno Beach, 12th SS and Hitler Youth they were fighting. And I think D3, they captured 30 Canadians, took them in the schoolyard and shot them in the back of the head one by one. The Canadians never ever took an SS prisoner afterwards, right to the end of the war. The moral of that is don't upset a Canadian, for God's sake. We came across a little village once, or small town, and they caught some French, you know, terrorists they were probably called by the Germans. And as they left the town, they set fire to the town, and as we were, and shot all the people in it. And as we walked in, hanging from a tree was a very young boy, 5 or 6 years old. We wanted to go after him, but keep your heads, you know, the order comes through, you're going to go rushing down there, they'll be waiting for you. The inclination was right, you know. Nasty individuals.
With Caen proving so difficult to seize, the Allied air forces were ordered to send their bombers in to destroy the German units that were putting up such a stern defence of the city.
Masses of bombers, both American bombers and British bombers, came over. They converged on Caen, but after a short while you saw nothing because of the dust, and the whole sky was obliterated out.
It left it in ruins. It left it in ruins, which really made it harder to take, because the Germans, you know, the enemy, they had the obvious hiding places to set up their bases to shoot back at the British and Canadians as they were coming in. You had to ferret each one out individually.
Whilst the bombers were busy in the skies over Caen, Typhoon fighter jets were attacking German forces and artillery on the ground.
Our tanks were outgunned, but the saviour was the Typhoon with its rockets. And the Germans, at one particular day, were up a hill, and we had no tanks with us, no armour with us. We got further ahead than probably where we should have been. But which often happened, because tanks will overnight, they won't move at night if they can help it. And we used to carry on moving. And coming up this hill was a Tiger, and Panthers and infantry. We were a bit scared by that, and suddenly over ahead of us, the back of us, over the top of this hill come 3 Typhoons. Germans were no cowards, no way, but their tops of them tanks opened and they ran for it. I swear those Typhoons had guided missiles in them, radio guided missiles. They never seemed to miss. They go shh, like that. And they hit this 60-ton tank, a Tiger, and it bounced like a rubber ball and blew up. Fantastic.
On the 17th of July, Erwin Rommel's war ended. He was seriously injured when an RAF fighter strafed his car near Caen. Soon after, Rommel was implicated in an attempted assassination of Hitler, which was to later cost him his life, as he was forced into committing suicide by the Nazi Party. The day after Rommel's injury, Bernard Montgomery launched Operation Goodwood, a large-scale attack to the east of Caen involving British and Canadian forces. After 2 days of bitter fighting and 4,000 Allied casualties, the city of Caen was taken. The operation was not a complete success in that Montgomery had failed to break out of Normandy, but it had diverted German attention away from the Americans in the west, allowing them to punch their way through to begin the liberation of France.
You go to Normandy now and you see roads named after American generals and all that sort of thing. And I've only seen one road named after an Englishman, and that was Montgomery Way. But even in Caen, they got an Eisenhower Way, But Eisenhower never went to Caen, but there it is. He's got a road named after him there.
If you look at any D-Day advert today, who was the first thing you see there on the covers? Americans. Americans, Americans, Americans. I got nothing against the Americans, but why is it all one-sided?
When I think of my friends whose lives were sacrificed that day, I feel very sorry. It brings a tear to my eye. Even today, I feel so sorry for them. And I think to myself, how was it I was so lucky?
Very, very proud and fond memories of the boys that I fought with and didn't come back. We fulfilled the promise we made to them 65 years ago. You won't be forgotten, you will be remembered. And that I find quite emotional at times because they were brothers in arms.